In September of 1959, the television show Bonanza broke the mold of television westerns by featuring stories about the trials and tribulations of the Cartwright clan. For 14 seasons, the Cartwrights, portrayed by Lorne Greene, Pernell Roberts, Dan Blocker, and Michael Landon, ran the famous Ponderosa Ranch, while during this whole time they gathered outrageously good ratings for the television network. But the series was almost canceled after the first season, and that was because the long-running Western actually faced off against Perry Mason during its first season. It wasn't even in the top 30 shows of that 1959-1960 season. NBC finally decided to keep the show on, and basically the only reason they did was because it was one of the first ones to be broadcast in color. They did a time slot change during the second season, and this caused Bonanza's ratings to rise. It eventually became the #1 show from 1964 to 1967. One of the things that's kind of curious to look at is that if you'll notice, the characters' clothes don't change from episode to episode. From the fourth season onward, the Cartwrights wear the same outfits, almost like cartoon characters. Doing this standardization made it possible and much more easier to reuse stock footage for action sequences, and it made it a whole lot easier to duplicate the wardrobe for the stunt doubles. Now, quite a few of the cast members wore hair pieces. During the last few years of the series, Lorne Greene, Pernell Roberts, and Dan Blocker all had to wear hair pieces because their hair was just naturally thinning out. Greene and Roberts actually started the show wearing hair pieces, but Dan Blocker ended up starting to wear a toupee in 1968. Even by today's standards, NBC's budget for Bonanza was really insane. They were given between $100,000 and $150,000 to shoot each episode, which they routinely had no problem using up. Over the course of Bonanza's 14 seasons, they shot 431 episodes. But you have to realize that that hefty investment that they made in the program really paid off. By 1970, the show had made the top 5 in the Nielsen ratings 9 years in a row. But you see, it wasn't just the show that brought in tons of revenue. There was clothing, there was toys, and other merchandise that was sold as well. After the show moved into its new time slot on Sunday nights, Bonanza rose to #1 pretty quickly in the ratings, and it picked up a lot of well-known viewers along the way. One of the most famous viewers and fan of the show was the king of rock and roll himself, Elvis Presley. As a matter of fact, when he actually met the cast one time, he was so starstruck that he asked them to take a picture with him. I think it was the storylines and the relatable characters that made Bonanza such a popular hit with a variety of audiences. It stayed in the #1 spot until 1967, when it was ousted out by a variety comedy show called the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. Dan Blocker, who played Hoss Cartwright, was a big man, and he had always been that way. He actually held the record for being the largest newborn baby born in Bowie County, Texas. He topped the scales at a whopping 14 pounds when he was born. That's nearly double the average weight of the normal baby. Then, by the time he was in the first grade, he had already grown to over 100 pounds. He put his weight to use later on and joined the high school football team. He not only was big, he was actually pretty tough too. In the role of Hoss Cartwright, he kind of played the fool, but he was actually always the one that you wanted to have on your side in a scuffle. Once, while he was filming a scene, he was thrown from his horse and he snapped his collarbone. Rather than go and get immediate medical attention, he basically decided to set the break himself, and he filmed through the pain until they finished. He did eventually take 6 weeks off to recover, but during this time he put on a lot of weight while he was just resting and not very mobile. It's ironic that the same horse that violently threw him off a few weeks before no longer was able to carry him because he had gained so much weight. Life was pretty short and pretty cruel for all of the Cartwright women. Paul Cartwright was 3 times widowed before the show even started. Over the course of the show, the women didn't fare much better. A lot of the Cartwrights' love interests passed through the Ponderosa, but none of them stayed very long. The cast used to joke that there was a Cartwright curse on the women. The female characters just never lasted. It's sad that the women that entered their lives were going to leave one of 2 ways. They were bound to either skip town or die tragically. As a matter of fact, women don't last longer than a few episodes, though we do get a few glimpses of Paul's wives during the flashbacks of the show from time to time. Now, the show was predominantly a show that centered around 4 characters. The storylines focused on each of those 4 characters pretty equally. Therefore, it just kind of stood to reason that the actors that played these characters should be paid basically equally. Throughout the first 4 seasons, Lorne Greene, Dan Blocker, Michael Landon, and Pernell Roberts all made the same salary. That's an unusual statement in itself. You never hear this kind of thing happening. Now, the 4 Cartwrights were paid pretty well, and they were the true stars of the show. But the guest actors were paid pretty handsomely, too. The guest actors were actually paid more than the actual Cartwright boys. Now, that seems kind of crazy, but there actually is a reason behind this madness. While Greene, Landon, Roberts, and Blocker all rose to stardom due to Bonanza, when the show first began, they were all relatively unknown. NBC thought that the only way that they stood a chance to get people interested in the show was to hire in some famous actors to appear in some of the episodes. By the time that the second season rolled around, the main characters had turned into stars, and they were all given a well-deserved pay raise. So this basically only happened during the first season. Unlike many of the westerns of the time, Bonanza was not shot at a film studio, or at least during the first few seasons that it aired it wasn't. At first, the show was filmed at Lake Hemet in California, before it moved to Lake Tahoe, which is where the fictional Ponderosa set was. By filming on location, this granted the show more authenticity, but it also came with some crazy struggles along the way. Later, when the budget improved, they began to film at Paramount Studios lot, and later at Warner Brothers Studio lot. Now, Bonanza was the first show to deal with the death of a young male character. When Dan Blocker died in between the show's 13th and 14th seasons, the producers had no choice but to address the problem and the death of the character. The sentiment of the production crew was that no one could actually refill his shoes. It was impossible. His role was just so distinct that no one could do it. So it was the first time in television history that they killed off a major young male character. Now, Lorne Greene was known for his voice, and it wasn't a good notoriety that he was known for. He was called the Voice of Doom when he was a radio announcer. He was a Canadian that originally started doing radio announcing for the Canadian Broadcasting Company during the Second World War. His official name, or nickname you might say, was called the Voice of Canada. But that booming voice of his and his role of delivering stressful news about the war led people to give him the nickname the Voice of Doom. NBC originally wanted somebody else to play the role of Adam Cartwright. They actually wanted Guy Williams, or Zorro, to play that role. And he probably would have accepted that had he not already accepted the role of Zorro. And then later he went on to be in Lost in Space. Pernell Roberts actually got the role after Guy Williams turned it down. Pernell Roberts was a more classically trained actor, and he started out with Bonanza thinking that he could tolerate playing in a Western. As time went on, he felt that this role was way below him. He didn't like it at all. He detested the show. He felt that he was above the rest of the actors. He actually called himself an aristocrat in his field of endeavor. He's often made the statement that being on the show was like Isaac Stern sitting in with Lawrence Welk, implying that the Western was just completely beneath him. He frequently complained about the show, and he did little to try to fix it, according to Michael Landon. He eventually left the show to pursue theater, something he thought was more of a highbrow entertainment than Westerns were. And the rest of the cast was just tickled to death to see him go. Not only did they not have to deal with his complaining, they actually took his salary and split it among themselves. Despite Michael Landon being very young and inexperienced at the time, he quickly grew a reputation for being difficult to work with on the set. It wasn't that he wasn't hard-working or that he was mean-spirited. He just had a narrow field of vision on the way he wanted scenes to look. He just had an extreme passion for his craft, and this could just get on some of the crew members' nerves from time to time. Then all of a sudden, the dreaded rural purge happened, and no Western television shows were safe at that point. Television networks just felt like there were too many Westerns and too many goofball comedies that related around farm life and country living. Even though all these shows were extremely popular, the network felt like that it targeted a small demographic, and they felt like they could capture much larger audiences with other shows. The Beverly Hillbillies, Green Acres, Hee Haw, and others all fell by the wayside. Then Bonanza, the longest-running Western, was the last to be canceled. In truth, the death of Dan Blocker just took the steam out of the show. They didn't really think that they could continue. They felt like it would never be the same, so they just finished her off. Now, this show was an absolute staple of 1960s television. If you grew up in the 60s, you knew about Bonanza. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll continue to chase the classics.